Dad, don't come tomorrow. You don't fit the hotel's image. That message reached me while I stood in my backyard, hammer in hand, repairing the old fence I had built with my son years ago. The hotel he planned to open the next night sat on my land. The $8 million loan carried my signature. Every permit pointed back to me, and yet my own son had decided I was too embarrassing to enter. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I opened my late wife's safe. 4 days later, his 37th missed call told me everything was falling apart. Welcome back to Dad's Sweet Revenge. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely? Just a simple yes or no is fine. Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Quick note, some details in this story have been adjusted for storytelling and reflection, but the lesson at its heart is what I hope stays with you. The hammer froze mid-swing when the phone buzzed in my flannel pocket. I was 69 years old that Friday afternoon in November, standing in my backyard in Parsons, Tennessee, repairing a pine fence I'd built 24 years earlier with my son. The light was golden, the way it gets in late autumn, soft and slanted, turning everything the color of honey. I'd been working for 2 hours, replacing rotted posts, one at a time, the way I'd been fixing things my whole life. Quietly, methodically, alone. The phone buzzed again. I set the hammer down on the fence rail and pulled the phone from my pocket. The screen showed a text from Preston, my son, 38 years old, now CEO of Lakeview Grand Resort, the kind of man who sent messages with the efficiency of someone scheduling deliveries instead of talking to his father. The message said, Dad, don't come tomorrow. Simone thinks you don't fit the hotel's image. I read it once, then twice, then a third time. The fence post I'd been hammering stood half-driven, the nail head still visible above the wood. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and picked up the hammer. I struck the nail 3 more times, clean, precise hits that sank it flush with the pine. Then I stopped completely. The resort. Tomorrow was the grand opening. I'd known about it for months. Preston had mentioned it in passing during our last phone call in September, the kind of casual reference that assumed I already had the details. I hadn't received an invitation, but I'd assumed that was an oversight. Preston was busy. Simone handled the event planning. I figured I'd just show up, shake some hands, stay out of the way. But now, I looked at the fence. It wasn't finished. Half the posts still needed replacing, and the horizontal rails sagged in places where the wood had warped over the years. I'd built this fence with Preston when he was 14, back when he still wanted to spend Saturdays working on projects with me instead of reviewing profit and loss statements. We'd measured every post together, leveled every rail, painted the whole thing white, because Hazel said it would look cleaner. Hazel had been gone for 7 years now, dead at 62 from cancer that moved faster than anyone expected. Her safe still sat in the corner of my office, holding the documents she'd taught me to read like a logistics manual. I walked inside. My office was a small room off the kitchen, lined with shelves that still held binders from my years running Bennett Freight. I'd spent 35 years building that company from a single truck to an 80-car fleet, and I knew exactly what it meant when someone tried to move cargo without telling the owner. I opened Hazel's safe. The combination was her birthday, July 12th of 1961. The door swung open with the same smooth click it had made the day she installed it, back when we first started putting together the paperwork for the resort. She'd insisted on organization, color-coded folders, alphabetical tabs, everything documented. I pulled out the thick folder labeled Lakeview Grand Resort and carried it to my oak desk. Inside were documents I hadn't reviewed in 6 months. I spread them out in a row the way I used to organize freight manifests, left to right, chronological order, each page telling part of a larger story. The 40-acre lakeside lease, my name as primary leaseholder, signed 18 months ago. The personal loan guarantee, $8 million. My signature at the bottom, right above the notary seal. Dated April 2022. The county building permits. Responsible party, Lawrence Thornton. Filed June 2022. The construction contracts. Guarantor Lawrence Thornton. August 2022. Every single document. My name, not Preston's. Mine. I sat down slowly in the chair Hazel used to sit in when she reviewed our taxes, the old wooden seat that creaked under my weight, the same way it had creaked under hers. The documents lay in front of me like evidence in a case I hadn't realized I was building. Hazel used to say, if your name is on the paperwork, you're not a guest. You're the one who decides who gets invited. I picked up the lease and read it again. 40 acres of prime lakeside property, leased under my name for 30 years with automatic renewal clauses. The resort sat on that land. Every room, every conference hall, every landscaped pathway, all of it resting on a lease that listed me as the responsible party. The loan guarantee was worse, $8 million in personal liability. If the resort defaulted, the bank came after me, not Preston, not his company. Me, my house, my savings, everything I'd built over 4 decades of work. And yet, tomorrow was the grand opening. The event Preston and Simone had been planning for 8 months. The night they'd invite investors and journalists and local politicians to tour the property, cut ribbons, make speeches about vision and legacy and building something that would last. And my son had just sent me a text message telling me not to come because I didn't fit the image. I sat there in my office with those documents spread across the desk, every single one bearing my name, not my son's. And I thought about the text message still sitting in my pocket. I wasn't being excluded from a party. I was being erased from something I owned. I needed to talk to someone who would tell me the truth without softening it. I found Lorraine Hewitt's name in Hazel's address book at 9:30 that night, written in the careful accountant's script my wife had used for everything that mattered. The leather-bound book sat on the shelf above my desk, where Hazel had kept it for 40 years, organized alphabetically with tabs she'd cut from colored cardstock. Some entries were crossed out, in black ink the dead. Others had phone numbers updated in pencil the living. Lorraine's entry had 3 phone numbers, office home, and a cell number added in Hazel's handwriting from 2015, the year before she got sick. I called the cell. She answered on the first ring. "This is Lorraine." Her voice was exactly the way I remembered it, from a decade ago. Direct, unsurprised, the tone of someone who expected late-night calls and was always ready for them. Lorraine Hewitt was 64 now, a semi-retired commercial real estate attorney who'd worked contracts with Hazel 20 years ago, when Bennett Freight was expanding into new routes. She'd reviewed every vendor agreement, every lease, every liability clause we signed. Hazel used to say Lorraine could read a contract the way I could read a freight manifest, seeing what wasn't there as clearly as what was. "Lorraine, this is Lawrence Thornton, Hazel's husband." "Lawrence." A pause. "It's been a long time. What's wrong?" No small talk, no "how have you been?" Just the immediate assumption that something was wrong, because people didn't call Lorraine Hewitt at 9:45 on a Friday night to catch up. "I need to talk to you about some documents I signed for my son's resort project." "Tell me every document you signed," she said. "Every single one. Don't skip anything." I went through the list, slowly, methodically, the way I used to inventory cargo shipments. The 40-acre lakeside lease with my name as primary leaseholder. The personal loan guarantee for $8 million. The county building permits listing me as responsible party. The construction contracts naming me as guarantor. The vendor accounts carrying my signature. She didn't interrupt. Didn't ask clarifying questions. Just let me talk for what felt like 6 full minutes. Her silence on the other end of the line as steady as Hazel's used to be when I came home from work, needing to explain a problem out loud before I could solve it. When I finished, she was quiet for another moment. "Lawrence, I need to see you in person. Tomorrow morning, early. Can you be in Nashville by 7:30? "Yes." "My office. Same building as before. I'll have coffee ready." She hung up without saying goodbye. Hazel had taught me to keep that address book current. Cross out the dead, update the living, never assume someone would be there when you needed them. I set the book back on the shelf and walked upstairs to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and the memory came back sharp and clear, the way memories do when you're too tired to keep them at bay. Summer 1999. Preston was 14 years old. We were building that fence together, the same fence I'd been repairing when his text message arrived this afternoon. The Tennessee heat that summer was relentless. the kind that made the air feel thick enough to chew. We'd been working since 7 in the morning, and by noon the temperature had climbed to 93 degrees. Preston hammered a nail into the fence post at an angle crooked enough that it would work loose in a year. I stopped him before he drove it all the way in. "You do it right, or you do it twice, son," I said. He looked at the nail, then at me, then pulled it out and tried again. This time it went in straight. He grinned, proud of himself in that unselfconscious way kids have before they learn to hide their feelings. "Got it, Dad. Watch this one." He drove the next nail perfectly on the first try. Hazel came out a few minutes later carrying 2 glasses of ice water on a tray, condensation already running down the sides. She stood in the shade of the oak tree she'd planted 2 years earlier, watching us work. "You two want water?" she called. "It's 93 degrees out here." Preston ran over and drained his glass in 4 long gulps. I drank mine slower, standing next to Hazel under that oak tree, both of us watching our son measure the next fence post with the level I'd taught him to use. "He's learning," Hazel said quietly. "He's a good kid," I said. She smiled. "He's your kid. Memory works like that sometimes. The harder you try to sleep, the sharper the images become, until the past feels more solid than the present." I could smell the cut pine from that afternoon 24 years ago. I could hear Preston's laugh when the nail went in straight. I could see Hazel's smile under that oak tree, still young and healthy, 7 years away from the cancer that would take her. You do it right, or you do it twice. Preston had learned the lesson. He'd learned it well enough to build an entire resort, well enough to structure contracts and negotiate loans and manage construction timelines, well enough to do everything right. Except he'd done it by erasing me from the project I'd funded. I finally fell asleep sometime near midnight, and when I woke, it was 5 in the morning. Saturday, November 11th, the day of the grand opening. I brewed a pot of coffee in the dark and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at that unfinished fence. 24 years ago, Preston and I had finished it together in 3 days. Now it sat half done, the rotted posts still waiting to be replaced, the rails still sagging where the wood had warped. I poured the coffee into a travel mug and walked out to my truck. I was driving to Nashville to meet a lawyer I hadn't seen in a decade to find out exactly what my son had built on top of my name. Lorraine was already at her desk when I walked in at 7:33, coffee cups lined up beside a stack of documents she'd pulled overnight. The office hadn't changed in 10 years. Same oak furniture, same shelves lined with legal binders, organized by year and client name, same framed Tennessee Bar Association certificate on the wall behind her desk. The only difference was the laptop, newer, thinner, and the gray in Lorraine's hair, which had been brown the last time I'd sat across from her. She looked up when I entered. "I pulled the county records last night after we hung up," she said. "Sit down, Lawrence." I handed her the Lakeview folder and sat in the leather chair across from her desk. She opened the folder and began spreading documents across the oak surface in methodical order, left to right, chronological. The same way I used to organize freight manifests at Bennett. Then she started reading. For 20 minutes she didn't say a word. I sat there drinking the coffee she'd poured for me, black no sugar the way Hazel used to make it, and watched her face for reactions. There weren't any. She read each page with the same neutral expression, occasionally making a mark in the margin with a pencil, flipping to the next document with practiced efficiency. The lease, the guarantee, the permits, the construction contracts. Every piece of paper I'd signed 18 months ago now laid out under fluorescent office lights on a Saturday morning, while my son prepared to cut ribbons at a grand opening I'd been told not to attend. Lorraine flipped the final page, set it down with precision, and looked up. "Preston's LLC has 0 collateral of its own," she said. "Every single asset backing this $8 million loan is yours personally, Lawrence. Your land, your accounts, your name." I set my coffee cup down slowly. What does that mean?" "It means if the resort fails to meet operating benchmarks, or if it defaults on any payment schedule, the bank doesn't go after Preston's business assets. They don't target his office equipment, or his receivables, or his future revenue. They come for you." She pulled one document from the stack, the loan guarantee, and placed it directly in front of me. Her finger rested on my signature at the bottom. The pen stroke I recognized from 18 months ago, when Preston had sat at my kitchen table with these papers spread out, asking for a little help getting started. They seized the 40 acres first, Lorraine continued, then the savings accounts, then anything else with your name attached to it. I stared at the signature, my handwriting, my legal commitment, my risk. Preston told me it was a formality, I said quietly. He said the bank required a family member on the paperwork for the first 3 years, just until the resort established operating history. That's partially true, Lorraine said. Banks do require guarantors for new hospitality ventures, but the structure here isn't a formality. It's a full personal guarantee with no cap, no sunset clause, and no co-guarantors. If this resort goes under, you lose everything. In 35 years of freight logistics, I'd learned that the person whose name is on the bill of lading owns the cargo. Everyone else is just moving boxes they don't control. How much risk are we talking about? I asked. Lorraine pulled another document from the stack, a cash flow projection I'd never seen before. According to the loan terms, the resort needs to maintain an operating margin of at least 12% by year 2 to avoid triggering default provisions. If they miss that benchmark, the bank can call the full guarantee immediately. And if they hit the benchmark, then nothing happens. The loan continues. Preston keeps running the resort, and you remain on the hook as guarantor until the loan is paid off or refinanced. How long is the loan term? 15 years. I sat back in the chair. 15 years. I'd be 84 years old when this guarantee finally expired, assuming the resort never missed a single benchmark, never defaulted on a single payment, never gave the bank any reason to come after the collateral that bore my name instead of my son's. What about the lease? I asked. The 40 acres that's in my name too. Lorraine nodded. You're the primary leaseholder. Preston's LLC is listed as the operator, but the lease obligation runs through you. If the resort closes, you're still responsible for the land payments. Hazel had been gone 7 years, but her accounts were still there, still bearing her name, still holding the savings from 30 years of careful work, and my son had put them at risk without telling me. Did Preston know this? I asked. When he signed these documents, did he understand that I was taking all the risk? Lorraine looked at me for a long moment. Lawrence, your son, is a businessman. He runs a resort. He negotiates contracts for a living. Yes, he knew. The coffee had gone cold in my cup. Outside Lorraine's office window, Nashville was waking up Saturday morning traffic building on the street. Below, people heading to breakfast, starting their weekends. Normal life continuing while I sat in a lawyer's office learning that my son had built an empire on my financial grave. So what does that mean? I asked again. Lorraine closed the folder and looked at me across that desk. It means your son is running a resort on your land, funded by your guarantee, backed by your life savings and the accounts Hazel left behind. She paused. And you were just told not to come to the opening. She let that sink in for a moment. The question isn't whether you have leverage, Lawrence. You're not just a guest at this resort. You're the foundation it's built on. Every contract, every permit, every loan document, your name is the one the bank looks at when they want their money. So what's the question? The question is what you're going to do with it. Lorraine picked up her phone without asking my permission and dialed the bank's loan department at 9:15 that morning. This is Lorraine Hewitt, she said when someone answered. Calling as legal counsel for Lawrence Thornton regarding the Lakeview Grand Resort loan. She waited, tapping a pen against her desk calendar with the same steady rhythm I'd seen her use 20 years ago when she reviewed contracts for Bennett Freight. The person on the other end must have transferred her because she repeated her introduction a moment later, this time adding my loan account number from memory. Yes, I'm calling to verify the current guarantor structure, she said. Has there been any communication from Preston Thornton or his LLC regarding modifications to the guarantee terms? Another pause. Lorraine's expression didn't change, but her pen stopped tapping. When was that? She asked. I watched her write something on a yellow legal pad 3 months ago. And what reason did he give? She wrote again, father getting older. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Carol Brennan, the bank's senior loan officer who'd handled the Lakeview financing. I couldn't hear her exact words, but I could hear the cautious precision in her tone, the sound of someone who understood that every word was being documented. Lorraine thanked her and hung up. She looked at me across the desk. 3 months ago, Preston called the bank asking about removing you as guarantor. He told them you were getting older and he wanted to protect you from the financial liability. I sat very still. What did the bank say? They refused. Preston's LLC doesn't have sufficient credit history or collateral to carry the loan independently. You're the only thing standing between this project and the bank saying no. She slid the legal pad across the desk so I could see what she'd written. The words looked worse in her handwriting than they had sounded out loud. "Lawrence, that is a line you need to remember," she said. "Your son didn't just exclude you from the opening. He tried to remove you from the loan 3 months ago, and when the bank wouldn't let him, he kept you on the documents while cutting you out of everything else." I stared out her office window at the Nashville skyline. Saturday morning sunlight reflected off glass buildings, people walking on sidewalks. Normal life. "What do I do?" I asked. "First you talk to people who know Preston better than I do," Lorraine said. "Find out if this is a pattern or an isolated decision. Then you come back here Monday morning and we figure out your options." I left her office at 10:30 and drove south. I had known Floyd Kelly for 43 years. We'd started Bennett Freight, together with 2 trucks and a handshake deal, and if Floyd was telling me to look over my shoulder, it wasn't paranoia. Floyd's farm sat on 120 acres of Tennessee land, directly adjacent to my 40-acre property. We'd bought the parcels within a year of each other back in the early 80s, back when land was cheap and the freight business was just starting to pay real dividends. His farmhouse sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, lined with oak trees that were older than both of us. He was waiting on his wooden porch when I pulled up at 2 that afternoon. 2 mugs of coffee, already sitting on the railing. "Figured you'd come by eventually," Floyd said. He was 72 now, 3 years older than me, with the kind of weathered face that comes from spending more time outdoors than in. He'd retired from Bennett Freight the same year I did, sold his shares for enough to live comfortably, and spent the last decade raising cattle and watching the seasons change from this porch. I climbed the steps and took one of the coffee mugs. "What do you know?" I asked. Floyd looked out at his fields golden in the November light, the same color my backyard had been yesterday afternoon when Preston's text arrived. "6 months back Preston came to see me," Floyd said. "Alone, no Simone. Asked to buy my 120 acres. Offered a fair price, too. But he said something that stuck with me." "What did he say?" "He said, 'Don't tell my dad. I want it to be a surprise for him.'" I set my coffee mug down on the porch railing. "He came alone." "Yeah. Middle of a Tuesday afternoon. Showed up in that black SUV he drives, walked me through his whole vision for expanding the resort. Footprint, connecting his property to yours, creating some kind of hospitality. Corridor along the lake. Real professional pitch. But then he added that line about keeping it secret. Said he wanted to surprise you at Christmas." Floyd turned to look at me. I told him no. Not because the offer was bad, it was fair money, but because something didn't sit right. A man doesn't surprise his father by buying land that borders his property without asking first. That's not how family works. "Did you tell him that—" "I told him I'd think about it. He said to take my time, just don't mention it to you. I kept quiet because I trusted your boy Walt. I figured maybe he knew something I didn't about how you two did business. In logistics, you learn to read a map backward. Start from where the cargo needs to end up, then trace every stop it made to get there. Preston had been building his route for months, and I was just now seeing the destination. Floyd," I said quietly, "what am I looking at here?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at those fields, the way men our age do when they're trying to figure out how to say something true without being cruel. "Lawrence Walt, I always called you that boy is drawing a map around you before you can even see it." I drove back from Floyd's farm in total silence. Didn't turn on the radio, didn't roll down the windows, just drove. Those 12 miles back to my house felt longer than they ever had before. The grand opening was happening in 5 hours, and I was starting to understand that the text message wasn't the beginning of this. It was just the first time Preston stopped hiding it. I pulled the Lakeview folder out of Hazel's safe again that evening, not to read the documents this time, but to put them in order, the way she'd taught me to organize anything that mattered. 6:30 p.m. The grand opening was starting in 30 minutes, and I was sitting at my desk reorganizing paperwork, like I used to organize freight manifests, by date, by type, by importance, methodical, controlled, the same way I'd approached every problem for 35 years. I stacked the lease on top, then the guarantee beneath it, the building permits, the construction contracts, the vendor accounts. Every document bearing my signature, every page that made Preston's resort legally possible, arranged in the order they'd been signed. Beneath the final page, I found something I hadn't noticed before. A small note card, 3 inches by 5 inches. Cream-colored cardstock with Hazel's careful accountant, handwriting in blue ink. I picked it up and read it in the yellow lamplight. Walt, when numbers don't add up, check who's doing the math. She'd written this for me years ago. I couldn't remember exactly when, but I recognized the context. We'd had an inventory discrepancy at Bennett Freight, back when we were still running 40 trucks and managing shipments across 6 states. One of our warehouse supervisors had been skimming cargo small amounts over months, hoping nobody would notice. Hazel caught it by running the numbers backward, checking who logged each shipment against who verified delivery. This wasn't a prophecy. It wasn't some supernatural message from beyond the grave. It was just practical advice from a woman who'd spent 30 years doing accounting work and understood that math didn't lie. But the people doing the math sometimes did. I set the card on my desk and stared at it. She'd been gone 7 years, but she was still right. Hazel used to tell me that the hardest part of accounting wasn't finding the error. It was accepting that someone you trusted put it there on purpose. I looked at the documents spread across my desk. Every signature mine, every risk mine, every legal obligation mine, and I thought about Preston's phone call to the bank 3 months ago. My father is getting older. The phrase Carol Brennan had quoted with such careful precision. When numbers don't add up, check who's doing the math. I closed the folder, placed Hazel's note card on top, and walked out to my truck. I wasn't going inside. I just needed to see it. The drive to Lakeview Grand Resort took 12 minutes from my house. The same roads I'd driven hundreds of times over the years, the same route I used to take when Preston was younger, and we'd go fishing at Kentucky Lake together. The same landscape, different destination. I arrived at 7 p.m. exactly. The parking lot was full. Luxury cars lined the rows, sedans and SUVs with dealer plates still visible in rear windows, the kind of vehicles people drove when they wanted you to know they could afford something better. I counted at least 50 cars, maybe more, all parked close to the entrance, where amber light spilled from massive glass windows. I parked in the far corner of the lot, 200 feet from the entrance, and turned off my headlights. For 40 minutes I sat there watching. Music drifted out from the resort. Faint, elegant, the kind of jazz quartet Preston had probably hired to make the right impression on investors. Shadows moved inside the glass-walled lobby. People in suits and cocktail dresses. Waiters carrying trays. Someone laughing too loud, the sound cutting through the November air. My son was in there somewhere, moving through that crowd, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, explaining his vision for the future of Tennessee hospitality. And I was parked on my own land, looking at a building funded by my own guarantee. Listening to laughter from people who didn't know my name was on every foundational document. I'd spent 40 minutes parked 200 feet from a party I'd funded on land I owned, watching my son celebrate something he'd built on top of my signature, and the distance between that truck and that door might as well have been 40 miles. At 7:40, I turned the key, shifted into gear, and drove home. 12 miles back, same roads, same landscape. I walked into my kitchen at 8:15 and stopped. There it was, a single sheet of paper resting alone on the counter, white against the dark wood. An email Preston had printed out and left behind during his last visit, forgotten in the rush. I picked it up. The header showed it was from someone named Terrence Whitfield, to Preston, dated 3 weeks ago. The subject line read, "Reacquisition Discussion, Lakeview Valuation." I read the first line and it stopped me cold. Preston following up on our conversation about the 34 Manors acquisition value and timeline for removing legacy assets from the ownership structure. $34 million. Not the $3.2 million construction cost Preston had mentioned when we signed the guarantee. Not the operating budget he'd walked me through at my kitchen table 18 months ago. $34 million. And legacy assets. I read the line again, my hand gripping the edge of the counter. The email was dated October 12th, 2023, 1 month before the opening, and it changed everything. I stood at my kitchen counter under the overhead light, the the printed page shaking slightly in my hands, and read the words a second time to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. From Terence Whitfield to Preston Thornton. Subject, RE acquisition discussion, Lakeview valuation. Preston following up on our conversation about the $34 million acquisition value and timeline for removing legacy assets from the ownership structure. Once we restructure the senior Bennett's name out of the primary documents, we can proceed with the valuation as discussed. Timeline still works for Q1 2026 close. Looking forward to finalizing terms next month. I read it a third time. $34 million. Preston had told me the entire project was worth about $9 million. Construction costs, furnishings, operating capital. The whole package. That's what he'd said when we signed the guarantee 18 months ago. 9 million, maybe 10 if the market held. Not 34, and legacy asset. My son had referred to me as a legacy asset in a business correspondence. The senior Bennett, not his father. Not the man whose signature made the loan possible. A legacy asset that needed to be restructured out of the ownership structure. I set the email down on the counter face up this time and stared at it. Legacy asset, the kind of language you use for outdated equipment. For machinery that needs replacing, for inventory you're trying to move off the books before the quarterly report. Q1 2026. First quarter 2 years from now. Preston wasn't just running a resort, he was planning to sell it. And he needed me removed from the documents before that sale could happen, because a buyer wouldn't want a 71-year-old guarantor on a $34 million asset. I picked up my phone and dialed Preston's number. 4 rings, then his voicemail. You've reached Preston Thornton. I'm unable to take your call right now, but if you leave a message. I hung up, waited 30 seconds, dialed again. 4 rings, voicemail. He was at the opening, probably standing in that glass-walled lobby, champagne in hand, explaining his vision to investors who didn't know my name was on every foundational document. Or maybe he was avoiding my calls deliberately. Maybe he'd seen my number light up his phone twice in 2 minutes and decided tonight wasn't the night to explain why he'd lied about everything. I set the phone face down on the counter beside the email. The house was quiet. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock Hazel had hung in 1987. 8:25 p.m. on a Saturday night, and I was standing alone in my kitchen, reading an email that proved my son had been planning to erase me from a project I'd made legally possible. I thought about 18 months ago. Preston had driven out to the house on a Tuesday afternoon in April 2022. No appointment, just showed up with a folder full of documents. And that smile he'd inherited from Hazel, the one that made you want to help before you'd even heard what he needed. We'd sat at the same kitchen table. He'd spread the papers out between us. Lease agreements, loan applications, construction contracts, and he'd talked for 45 minutes about his vision for Lakeview Grand Resort. The lighting, the bar, the way the lake would look through floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of place that would put Tennessee hospitality on the national map. Dad, I can see it all, he'd said. I just need a little help getting it off the ground. A little help. 18 months ago, my son sat at this table and called it a little help. $8 million in personal guarantees. 40 acres of land I'd bought with Hazel in 1985. And my name on every document that mattered. I'd signed everything he put in front of me. Not because I didn't understand the risk. I'd run Bennett Freight for 35 years. I knew what a personal guarantee meant. I knew what happened when projects failed and banks came looking for collateral. I'd signed because he was my son, and he'd asked me to trust him. I walked to the cabinet above the sink and pulled down the bottle of whiskey I kept for nights when the house felt too quiet, poured a finger into a short glass, set it on the counter next to the email and the phone, didn't touch it. I needed a clear head. The email sat there under the kitchen light white paper, against dark wood, every word still exactly where I'd read it 3 times already. $34 million. Legacy asset. Q1 2026 close. Preston hadn't pushed me out because I didn't fit the image of a modern resort owner. He hadn't excluded me from the opening because Simone thought I looked too old in flannel and work boots. He'd excluded me because I'd guaranteed $8 million for an asset worth $34 million, and someone, maybe Preston, maybe this Terence Whitfield, Maybe both of them together wanted me out before I understood what I'd built. Before I realized that the man they were calling a legacy asset had created something worth 4 times what they'd told him it was worth. I sat down at the kitchen table with that email in front of me and the untouched whiskey beside it. The grand opening was still happening 12 miles down the road. Music still playing. Champagne still flowing. My son still shaking hands with people who thought he'd built this whole thing himself. And I needed to know who else knew. I sat at that kitchen table for 2 hours that night, not moving, just thinking about the arithmetic of betrayal. The email lay in front of me. The whiskey sat untouched beside it. The wall clock ticked past 9, then 9:30, then 10. I didn't turn on the radio. Didn't pick up the phone again. Just sat there working through the numbers the way I used to work through freight manifests when cargo didn't match the shipping invoice. $8 million guaranteed for a $9 million project. That's tight, but it's reasonable. That's a father helping his son get started. That's family. $8 million guaranteed for a $34 million project. That's something else entirely. That's either criminal negligence or calculated fraud, and Preston had an MBA from Vanderbilt. He understood numbers better than I ever would, which meant he'd known. Every time he sat at this table asking for my signature, he'd known the real numbers. Every kitchen table conversation about needing a little help to get the project off the ground, all of it happened while Preston had the true valuation in his files and chose to give me the false one. I thought about the lease I'd signed. 40 acres of lakeside property in my name leased to Preston's LLC for 30 years. If I'd known the resort was worth 34 million instead of 9, would I have signed the same terms? Would I have accepted the same exposure? No. I would have structured it differently, protected myself differently, asked different questions. And Preston knew that, which is why he'd given me the $9 million number instead of the $34 million truth. Hazel used to say that accounting wasn't about the numbers, it was about who got to decide which numbers mattered. And I was starting to understand that Preston had been deciding for 18 months without telling me. The opening was happening right now, 12 miles down the road. I should have been there. Not as a guest, not as someone Preston invited out of obligation, but as the man whose name was on every foundational document. The man who made the whole thing legally possible. Instead, I was sitting in my kitchen reading an email my son had accidentally left behind, learning that he'd spent the last month planning to restructure me out of the ownership structure so he could sell the resort for $34 million in 2 years. Legacy asset. I looked at those words again and something cold settled in my chest. What I didn't know that night, what I wouldn't learn until 3 days later, was what Preston was saying about me at that exact moment. While I sat at my kitchen table discovering the $34 million lie, Preston was standing in the glass-walled lobby of Lakeview Grand Resort Champaign, in hand greeting VIP guests. Gerald Howell was there, a Nashville logistics executive who'd contracted with Bennett Freight for 15 years back when I was still running routes across 6 states. Gerald knew me as one of the most reliable operators in Tennessee, someone who delivered on time, every time without excuses. Gerald walked up to Preston around 8:45 that night and asked the question everyone in the room should have been asking. "Where's your father, Preston? I heard he put up the land for this place." Preston didn't miss a beat. "Dad's getting older," he said. "He prefers to stay home these days. This is really a new generation thing." Gerald stared at him for a moment, didn't say anything else, just nodded slowly and walked away. Across the room, Celeste Sinclair was watching. Celeste was 42, a Tennessee business and hospitality reporter who'd been covering the state's tourism sector for 15 years. Simone had invited her to the opening specifically to write a feature about the resort, the kind of promotional piece that would run in the business journal and get picked up by travel magazines across the region. Celeste stood there with a notepad in her hand, watching Preston's face as he explained his father's absence to a room full of investors who'd never heard my name mentioned once all evening. She wrote something down. "If you've ever had someone you raised speak about you like you're a problem they're managing instead of a person they know, you understand exactly what I felt when I heard those words 3 days later. Getting older. Prefers to stay home. A new generation thing. I was 69 years old. I'd built Bennett Freight from a single truck to an 80-car fleet, sold it for enough money to retire comfortably, and spent the last 7 years managing the accounts Hazel had left behind with the same careful precision she'd taught me. I wasn't senile. I wasn't incompetent. I wasn't someone who needed to be managed or hidden away while younger people did the real work. I was the man who'd signed an $8 million personal guarantee so my son could build a resort on land I owned. And Preston had just told a room full of people, including a man who'd known me for 15 years, that I was too old to attend the opening of a project I'd made possible. I didn't know about the insult until Tuesday morning, 3 days after the opening, when Celeste Sinclair called me. She'd pulled my number from the county land records, and my name was listed as the primary leaseholder for the 40 acres. Right there in public documents anyone could access. She called at 9 a.m. and introduced herself. Professionally explained she'd been at the opening Saturday night, and asked if I had a few minutes to talk about the resort. Then she told me what Preston had said. Word for word, Dad's getting older, he prefers to stay home these days. This is really a new generation thing. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, listening to a stranger repeat my son's public dismissal of me, and I finally understood why Celeste had decided to write a different story than the one Simone had asked for. She'd heard the lie. She'd checked the county records, and she'd seen the gap between what Preston was telling investors and what the legal documents actually said. The church was empty when I walked in at 7 Sunday morning, just me and Pastor Ernest Dawson sitting in the front pew like we'd done 40 years before when Hazel and I first moved to Parsons. Ernest was 70 years old now, 10 months older than me, with silver hair and the kind of weathered hands that came from 4 decades of shaking hands with congregants after Sunday services. He'd been the pastor at Parsons Community Church since 1984, before Hazel and I bought our house, before Preston was born, before Bennett Freight had more than 2 trucks. He looked up when I walked in, but didn't seem surprised. "Walter," he said. I sat down beside him in the front pew. Early morning light filtered through the stained glass windows on the east wall, reds and blues and yellows painting patterns across the empty wooden benches. The church smelled like old hymn books and lemon polish, the same smell it had carried for as long as I could remember. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Ernest didn't ask why I was there, didn't offer prayers or scripture or comfort. He just sat beside me the way he'd sat beside me 7 years ago when Hazel died, and 10 years before that, when the freight business nearly went under during the recession, and 20 years before that, when Preston was going through his divorce from his first wife. Finally he spoke. "What are you afraid of, Walter? Not what happened, not what I needed, not what God wanted me to do. What was I afraid of?" I sat with that question for a long time, watching the colored light move across the floor as the sun rose higher outside. "I'm afraid that if I do nothing," I said slowly, "I'm saying this is acceptable, that a son can lie to his father about millions of dollars and dismiss him publicly as too old to matter, and the father just accepts it because that's what family does." Ernest nodded but didn't speak. "And I'm afraid that if I do something," I continued, "I become someone Hazel wouldn't recognize, someone who uses legal leverage against his own son, someone who turns family into a business transaction." Ernest looked at me for a moment, then turned his gaze to the altar at the front of the church, the same simple wooden cross that had been there since the building was constructed in 1952. "Then you already know what to do," he said quietly. "You just need permission to do it." I looked at him. Permission. You came here this morning because you've already made your decision. You're just afraid it's the wrong one. You're afraid Hazel would be disappointed. You're afraid you're being vindictive instead of protective. He turned back to face me. "But Hazel taught you how to read a balance sheet, didn't she? She taught you that numbers don't lie, and when someone gives you false numbers, they're not making a mistake, they're making a choice." Ernest had known me since I was 31 years old, and Hazel was 34, back when we'd just moved to Parsons with a baby in a single freight truck. He'd watched me build Bennett Freight from nothing, bury my wife, raise my son through the years after Hazel was gone, and in all that time he'd never once told me what to do, only asked me what I was afraid of, and let me find my own way to the answer. "What would Hazel do?" I asked. "Hazel would check the math," Ernest said simply. "And if the math showed someone was lying to her, she'd make sure they understood she knew. Not out of spite, out of principle. He was right. Hazel had spent 30 years doing accounting work for Bennett Freight and a dozen other small businesses in Parsons. She'd caught embezzlement twice, fired a warehouse supervisor for cooking inventory numbers, and once testified in court against a vendor who'd been double billing us for deliveries that never happened. She hadn't done those things because she was cruel. She'd done them because letting someone steal from you, whether it was money or land or dignity, wasn't kindness. It was permission. Hazel used to say that permission was the strangest kind of gift. You can't ask for it without already knowing you need it. And once someone gives it to you, you realize you were the only one who could grant it in the first place. Preston put my name on documents worth $34 million, I said. Then he lied to me about what they were worth, tried to remove me from the guarantee when the bank wouldn't let him, and told people I was too old to attend the opening. Ernest nodded slowly. And now you're asking me if defending what's yours makes you the villain of your own story. Does it? No, Walter. It makes you the man Hazel married, the one who knew when to build and when to protect what he'd built. We sat in silence for another 10 minutes. The light through the stained glass shifted as the sun climbed higher. Somewhere outside, a car door closed and an engine started. I stood up. Thank you, Ernest. He stood too, placed a hand on my shoulder, the way he'd done at Hazel's funeral. You're not doing this to hurt him, Ernest said. You're doing it to make sure he understands what he did. There's a difference. I nodded. I walked out of that church at 7:30. Sunday morning, drove the 12 miles back to my house and stood in my kitchen with the phone in my hand. Lorraine answered on the second ring. This is Lorraine. Let's begin, I said. She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't ask if I was sure. She'd been waiting for this call since Saturday morning when she'd spread those documents across her desk and explained exactly what leverage I had. Monday morning, she said. 7:30, my office. Bring everything. I will. I hung up and looked out the kitchen window at the unfinished fence in my backyard. 24 years ago, Preston and I had built it together in 3 days. Now it sat half done, the old posts rotting, the new ones standing straight where I'd replaced them Friday afternoon before his text message arrived. Monday morning I would find out exactly what I'd been missing. I opened the ledger Sunday afternoon and read the first entry to Lorraine over the phone dated May 15th, 2022, 3 months after Preston asked me to sign the guarantee. Excluded from design meeting, told decisions already made. The ledger was leather-bound, the same type I'd used for Bennett Freight shipping manifests for 35 years. Black cover, lined pages, room for dates, descriptions, and notes. Hazel had taught me the practice back when we were first starting the freight business, and a client tried to claim we'd damaged a shipment we'd never even touched. If it's not written down, it didn't happen, Walt, she'd said. Memory is just a story you tell yourself. Paper is evidence. So I'd started documenting. Not immediately. Not the day Preston asked me to sign the guarantee. Not even the first month after construction began. But in month 3, when I drove out to the construction site unannounced and found Preston in a design meeting with his architect reviewing plans for the lobby layout. And he looked surprised to see me there, like I was interrupting instead of participating. I'd gone home and pulled out a new ledger. May 15, 2022. Excluded from design meeting, told decisions already made. From that day forward, I logged everything. Every meeting invitation that never came. Every email where I'd been CC'd initially but removed from follow-up threads. Every check I wrote for construction expenses that went unacknowledged. Every phone call Preston didn't return for 3 days, then 4, then a week. 18 months of entries in neat freight manifest handwriting. I wasn't sleeping, Lorraine, I told her over the phone. I was building a case. She was quiet for a moment. How detailed are these entries? Dates, times, witnesses when applicable. I have the email threads, the unanswered voicemails, the checks with my signature that were cashed without confirmation. Walter, this is exactly what we need. Can you bring it Monday morning? I'll bring everything. In freight logistics, you don't file an insurance claim on a damaged shipment until you've documented every mile it traveled, every hand that touched it, every signature on every transfer form, because without the paper trail, you're just making noise. I'd learned that lesson 35 years ago, and I'd applied it here. People had probably thought I was naive, passive, too trusting. The old man who didn't understand modern business and couldn't keep up with his ambitious son's plans. But I wasn't passive. I was patient. There's a difference between not seeing what's happening and choosing to wait until you have the complete picture before you act. I'd needed to know if this was a single mistake or a pattern, if it was forgetfulness or strategy, if it was my son being busy or my son actively erasing me. Now I knew. I hung up with Lorraine around 1:30 and went back to reviewing the ledger entries, preparing to photocopy the relevant pages for Monday's meeting. My phone rang again at 3 p.m. "Lorraine, I found something," she said without preamble. "I've been searching the Tennessee County Recorder's database for every document tied to your 40 acres. And there's an amendment to land use agreement filed 2 months ago, September 2023. It modifies the terms of your lease with Preston's LLC." I sat down slowly in my desk chair. "What kind of modifications?" "That's what I need to verify. The document bears what appears to be your signature, but I want to confirm it's legitimate before I tell you what it says. Some of these amendments are routine administrative updates. Others can fundamentally change ownership rights." "Did I sign it?" "That's what I'm going to find out. I'm requesting the original filing documents from the county tomorrow morning. I'll compare the signature to your other documents. If there's any discrepancy, we'll know." "How long will that take?" "Give me 48 hours. I want to be absolutely certain before I tell you what this means." I looked at the calendar on my office wall. Sunday the 12th, Monday the 13th, Tuesday the 14th. 48 hours meant Tuesday afternoon. "All right," I said. "Walter, if this signature isn't yours, we're not just looking at business ethics violations. We're looking at potential forgery. That's a felony." Hazel used to say that patience and passivity looked identical from the outside, but the difference was simple. Passive people wait for things to happen to them. Patient people wait until they have everything they need to make things happen. I'd waited 18 months. I could wait 48 more hours. "Do what you need to do," I told Lorraine. "I'll be at your office Monday morning at 7:30 with the ledger. See you then." I hung up and sat at my desk for a few minutes, looking at the ledger lying open in front of me. 18 months of documentation. Every exclusion, every removed email, every unacknowledged contribution, and now possibly a forged signature on a document I'd never seen. I stood up, walked through the kitchen, and stepped out into the backyard. The hammer was still sitting on the porch steps, where I'd left it Friday afternoon, 3 days ago, when Preston's text message had arrived, telling me not to come to the opening. The fence stood half-finished, old posts, rotting beside new ones I'd already replaced horizontal rails, sagging where the wood had warped over 24 years. I picked up the hammer. The handle was smooth from decades of use, the same hammer I'd used to build the original fence with Preston when he was 14. The same hammer that had sat unused for 3 days while I discovered what my son had been hiding. I positioned a new nail against the fence post and drove it in with 3 clean strikes. Then another, then another. The fence wasn't going to finish itself, and I had 48 hours to wait before Lorraine would tell me whether my signature on that amendment was real or forged. 48 hours before I'd know if my son's betrayal had crossed the line from deception into felony. I kept hammering. Monday would bring answers I wasn't ready for. Lorraine was still in the same clothes she'd worn Sunday when I walked into her office Monday morning at 8-3 coffee cups lined up on her desk beside a contract I'd never seen before. She looked up when I entered, and I could see she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that had started to come loose. The office smelled like old coffee and exhaustion. "I've been pulling every clause in your loan document since yesterday afternoon," she said without preamble. "Sit down, Lawrence. You need to see this." I sat in the leather chair across from her desk and set the ledger I'd brought on the armrest. Lorraine pushed the contract toward me, a thick commercial loan agreement with tabs marking different sections. Her finger rested on one page in particular, highlighting a block of text in the middle of the document. "Section 7.3, she said. "Change of control clause." I leaned forward to read it. The language was dense, the kind of legalese that turns simple concepts into paragraph-long sentences, but the meaning was clear enough once you stripped away the extra words. "Any change in the ownership structure of the borrowing entity without the express written consent of the guarantor shall constitute an event of default, entitling the lender to declare all outstanding principal and interest immediately due and payable." I read it twice. What does that mean in practice? I asked. It means if Preston changes who owns the LLC, without your explicit written permission, the bank can declare a default and demand the full loan balance, typically within a 30-day cure period. Not in 15 years when the loan matures, within 30 days of the trigger. She pulled another document from the stack, the email I'd found on my kitchen counter from Terrence Whitfield about the equity deal. Preston is planning to sell 40% equity in the LLC to Kestrel Capital Partners. That's Terrence Whitfield's investment firm. That sale qualifies as a change in ownership structure under Section 7.3. And I haven't given written consent, I said slowly. Have you given any consent? Has Preston even mentioned this equity sale to you directly? No. Lorraine nodded. Then the moment he signs that deal, he triggers this clause. The bank can call the entire loan $8 million due immediately. I sat back in the chair. Preston doesn't have $8 million. No, he doesn't. But you guaranteed the loan personally. When the bank demands payment and that Preston can't deliver, they don't go after his LLC's assets. They don't sue his business. They come for you. She pulled out yet another document, the personal guarantee I'd signed at my kitchen table with Preston 18 months ago. Your 40 acres, your savings accounts, everything Hazel left behind in those trust accounts. The bank has first claim on all of it the moment this clause triggers. In freight, we called this a deadweight clause, language buried so deep in a contract that nobody reads it until the cargo's already damaged, and the insurance company points to page 17, paragraph 4, subsection C, and says, you agreed to eat the loss. I'd seen it happen dozens of times over 35 years, usually to small operators who signed vendor agreements without reading the fine print, then discovered they'd agreed to pay for damage they didn't cause and delays they couldn't control. I'd always been more careful than that, until now. When is Preston planning to close this equity deal? I asked. The email from Terrence mentioned Q1 2026, first quarter of next year. That's less than 3 months away. And if he triggers the clause, if the bank calls the loan, what happens to the resort? The bank forecloses. They seize the property, sell it at auction to recover their money. Preston loses the resort. You lose everything you guaranteed. And Kestrel Capital walks away with whatever they negotiated in their equity agreement, probably a priority claim that lets them get paid before anyone else. Lorraine leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. Lawrence, this isn't a business miscalculation. This is a trap, and your name is on every piece of it. I thought about the text message Preston had sent Friday afternoon. Don't come tomorrow. Simone thinks you don't fit the hotel's image. I thought about the email talking about removing legacy assets from the ownership structure. I thought about Preston standing in the resort lobby Saturday night telling Gerald Howell that I was getting older and preferred to stay home. And now this. A clause that would destroy everything the moment Preston signed his equity deal, with my name positioned to absorb every dollar of loss, while Preston restructured his way into a sale that valued the resort at $34 million instead of the $9 million he'd told me it was worth. Does Preston know about this clause? I asked. Lorraine looked at me across the desk. Lawrence, he read the contract. He signed the LLC operating agreement that references it. His attorney would have explained it to him. He knows. I'd signed that guarantee 18 months ago, sitting at my kitchen table with Preston across from me, his hand on my shoulder, saying, Dad, this is just a formality. And I'd trusted him enough not to read every word, which was exactly the kind of mistake Hazel had spent 30 years telling me never to make. Always read the whole contract, she'd say, especially the parts someone tells you not to worry about. I looked down at section 7.3, again at the dense legal language that turned my trust into a weapon Preston could use to take everything I had. So he knows, I said quietly. He knows that signing this equity deal will trigger the clause, force the bank to demand $8 million he doesn't have, and put my land and Hazel's accounts at risk. Yes. Then the question is whether he's planning to trigger it on purpose, I said, or whether he just doesn't care what happens to me when it blows up. Lorraine was quiet for a moment. Either way, she said, we need to know how deep this goes. Lorraine found the court record. Monday afternoon, a 6-year-old Tennessee docket from 2017 filed 3 years before Preston ever met Simone. She pulled it up on her computer screen and turned the monitor so I could see it from across her desk. The document header read, Davidson County Circuit Court Case, numbers 17 CV 8842. Plaintiff Michael Henderson, defendant Preston Thornton. LLC ownership dispute, Lorraine said quietly. Filed April 2017. Your son's first business partner sued him. I leaned forward, reading the case summary on the screen. The plaintiff, Michael Henderson, had invested in Preston's first venture, a boutique consulting firm. According to the complaint, Henderson claimed Preston had systematically excluded him from business decisions. After the company became profitable, then attempted to restructure him out of his equity stake through a series of amendments Henderson never authorized. The language was familiar, too familiar. What happened to the case? I asked. Settled out of court 3 months after filing. Record sealed as part of the settlement agreement. I can't see the terms. But the fact that it settled quickly and quietly usually means someone paid enough money to make the problem go away. Lorraine closed the file and looked at me. This wasn't Simone's idea, Lawrence. Your son knew how to do this before he ever met her. I sat back in the chair, staring at the blank screen where the court docket had been a moment before. 6 years ago, 2017, Preston would have been 32 years old, fresh out of his MBA program, ambitious, building his first real business. And he'd already learned how to exclude a partner who trusted him, how to restructure someone out of ownership, how to use legal language as a weapon. I'd known about that business vaguely. Preston had mentioned it once or twice in passing, said it hadn't worked out. Said he'd learned important lessons about partnership dynamics. He'd made it sound like a mutual parting, the professional difference of opinion that ended amicably. He'd never mentioned a lawsuit. He'd never mentioned restructuring someone out. He'd never mentioned that the person who sued him had accused him of the exact same pattern I was watching play out now. I had spent 6 years believing my son had changed after that first business failed, that he'd learned something, grown from it, and all along he'd just learned how to do it better the second time with someone who loved him. Enough not to read the fine print. I need copies of everything I said. I'll have them ready by tomorrow, Lorraine said. I drove home from Nashville in silence, the same 12 miles I'd driven dozens of times over the last few days, and tried not to think about what it meant that my son had done this before. Tuesday afternoon, Alara showed up at my house. It was the first time I'd seen her since the opening, the first time Simone had let her visit since Preston's text message told me not to come. She ran up my driveway at 2 p.m., her mother's car idling at the curb, carrying a bag of apples. Grandpa, she called, 8 years old, with bright eyes and her father's easy smile. Mom said I could visit while she runs errands. I hugged her and we sat on the front porch steps, together, eating apples in the November sun. She chattered about school, her teacher, her friends, a drawing she'd made in art class that won a ribbon. I listened, nodding in the right places, asking questions about her favorite subjects. Then she said something that made me stop mid-bite. Grandpa Dad's office at the hotel has big maps all over the wall, lines going way past the lake. I kept my voice light, casual. Maps of what, sweetheart? I don't know, but they're really big. He and Uncle James look at them every week. I set my apple core down on the porch step. Who's Uncle James? Dad's friend. He comes to the hotel every Tuesday. They go in the office and close the door and talk about the lines on the map. She said it the way 8-year-olds say everything matter-of-fact, completely unaware that what she was telling me mattered. Children tell you everything. If you know how to listen, they haven't learned yet that some truths are supposed to stay locked behind office doors, that some maps aren't meant for grandfathers to see. What do the lines look like? I asked, keeping my voice steady. They go all around the hotel and then keep going, way past where the water is. Uncle James points at them and Dad writes things down. I smiled at her, ruffled her hair gently. That sounds interesting. Are you still taking drawing class? She launched into a story about her art teacher, and I listened, nodding, asking questions, all while something cold settled in my chest. Preston was planning expansion beyond the 40 acres. He was meeting every week with someone I'd never heard of, this James, whoever he was, and they were mapping territory that included land I hadn't agreed to develop. Land that went past the lake, past the resort's current footprint, possibly past the property line entirely. And he was doing it in secret behind closed office doors, while his 8-year-old daughter watched him point at maps she didn't understand. Alara finished her apple and looked up at me. Grandpa, are you coming to the hotel sometime? I looked at her for a moment. Those bright eyes that looked so much like Preston's had, at that age, before I knew what he was capable of. "Someday, sweetheart," I said. "Someday." She hugged me tight, then ran back to her mother's car when Simone pulled up at the curb. I watched them drive away Alara, waving through the back window, until they turned the corner and disappeared. I sat on those porch steps for 20 minutes after she left, staring at the empty driveway, thinking about maps with lines going past the lake, past the 40 acres I owned, past the fish pond Hazel and I had dug in 1998, the one Preston and I used to fish at together when he was Alara's age, past everything I'd built and everything I'd protected. I needed to see those maps for myself. I opened the ledger Tuesday night. Not to the pages where I documented 18 months of exclusion, but to a blank page at the back where I could build something new. No more passive recording, no more waiting to see what Preston would do next. This was the page where I would chart what came next methodically like a freight shipping manifest. I pulled out the pen Hazel had given me 30 years ago, a black roller ball with Bennett Freight etched on the side, and started writing. Step 1. Confirm change of control clause. Timeline with Lorraine. When exactly is the equity deal scheduled to close? Step 2. Audit all county recorder documents. Verify the amendment's authenticity. Check signature against known samples. Step 3. Verify liquor license liability exposure. Confirm if my name is still listed as designated responsible party. Step 4. Draft formal legal notices. Prepare written refusal of consent for any ownership changes. Step 5. Document all communications. CC Lorraine on everything. Create paper trail. Each line short, precise, numbered. The same format I'd used for 35 years when cargo went missing or delivery routes got disrupted. Not emotional, not vengeful, just methodical problem solving written down in black ink on white paper. Hazel had spent 30 years teaching me that every problem had a manifest, a numbered list of what went wrong, who touched it, and what needed fixing. And the only difference between a salvageable situation and a total loss was whether you had the discipline to write it down before you started swinging. I'd learned that lesson during the Bennett Freight days when a warehouse supervisor had been skimming inventory. Hazel caught it not by yelling at the man, but by creating a spreadsheet that tracked every discrepancy back to his shift schedule. When she finally confronted him, she didn't raise her voice, once just showed him the numbers and asked him to explain them. He couldn't. That's what I needed now. Not anger, not confrontation, just numbers that couldn't be explained away. I completed the checklist, closed the ledger, and picked up my phone. I sent Lorraine a single text Monday. She responded 30 seconds later, 8 a.m., bring everything. I set the phone down and looked at that blank page, now filled with 5 numbered steps, that would either protect everything I had or prove that my son had crossed a line I couldn't forgive. Before I show you what I discovered in those county records on Monday, comment A, if you think Preston forged that signature himself, or B, if someone else did it for him, and add one short reason why. Please note, what follows includes some recreated details for narrative depth. The lesson is what matters. I spent the entire weekend finishing the fence. Saturday morning at 7, I walked out to the backyard with my toolbox and the stack of lumber I'd bought 3 weeks ago. No calls to Preston, no emails to Lorraine, just 2 days of driving every nail straight and aligning every board level. The work was repetitive, methodical, exactly what I needed. Measure the gap between posts, cut the board to length, hold it level, drive 3 nails top, middle, bottom, move to the next section, repeat. Saturday bled into Sunday. I stopped only for meals and sleep. Sunday morning I attended church like I'd done every week for 40 years. Ernest found me on the front steps after the service, standing in the November sun, car keys already in my hand. "How are you holding up, Walter?" he asked. I looked at him for a moment. "I'm finishing the fence," I said. Ernest studied my face, then nodded once. He understood I wasn't talking about wood. "Good," he said quietly. "Finish what you start." I drove home and went straight back to the fence. I'd started that fence with Preston when he was 14, taught him how to measure twice and cut once, how to drive a nail straight, how to build something that would last. And now I was finishing it alone 24 years later. The day before, I would use every lesson I'd ever learned to dismantle what he'd built on top of my name. Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock, I drove the final nail. I stepped back and looked at what I'd built. 48 feet of Tennessee pine, every board aligned, every nail sunk flush. The fence ran straight from the oak tree Hazel had planted it in 2001 to the corner post near the property line, marking the border of the 40 acres we'd bought in 1998. I ran my palm along the smooth wood, feeling for rough edges or loose boards. Found none. The fence was solid, built right, built to last. Exactly the way Hazel had taught me to build everything, whether it was a business, a reputation, or a barrier that marked what was mine and what wasn't. I walked inside, washed my hands at the kitchen sink, and looked at the calendar on the wall. Sunday, November 19th. Tomorrow was Monday, November 20th. Lorraine was expecting me at 8 a.m. I'd spent 10 days discovering what my son had hidden from me. I'd documented 18 months of exclusion. I'd found the court records showing he'd done this before. I'd learned about the change of control clause that would destroy me the moment he signed his equity deal. I'd heard from my granddaughter about secret maps and weekly meetings with someone named James. And I'd finished the fence. Tomorrow was Monday, November 20th. Lorraine was expecting me at 8 a.m. It was time to find out exactly what my son had signed without telling me. Lorraine was standing when I walked into her office Monday morning at 8. She never stood to, which meant whatever she had to show me was bad enough that sitting down felt wrong. She didn't say good morning, didn't ask about my weekend, just gestured to the single document lying on her desk between us. I need you to look at this, she said. I sat down and pulled the document toward me. Amendment to Land Use Agreement. Tennessee County Recorder stamp in the upper right corner. Filed September 20th, 2023. 2 months before the grand opening. 2 months before Preston sent me the text message telling me not to come. And there at the bottom of the page was a signature in blue ink, Lawrence Thornton. I stared at it. Did you sign this, Lawrence? Lorraine asked. I picked up the document and studied the handwriting. Someone had practiced my signature. The loops were close, the spacing almost right. But the slant was wrong. Too vertical. And the pressure was inconsistent, heavier on the downstrokes than I ever wrote. I shook my head. No, I said quietly. That's not my signature. Lorraine's expression hardened. That's what I thought. This is document forgery, Lawrence. This is a felony. I set the document back down on her desk and read through it carefully. The amendment modified the land use classifications on my 40 acres, rezoning portions from agricultural to commercial development, expanding the allowable building footprint, removing restrictions on multi-phase construction. All of it setting up Preston's expansion plans, the maps Alara had mentioned, the lines going way past the lake, and someone had signed my name to authorize it without my knowledge or consent. Who filed this, I asked. According to the county recorder, it was submitted by mail with a notarized signature verification. I'm requesting the original notary records now to see who witnessed the signature. Preston. We'll know more when I get the notary certification, but Lawrence, this isn't a contract dispute anymore. This isn't your son making bad business decisions. Someone committed a crime using your name. Forgery, not a civil contract dispute. You settle in mediation, not a family disagreement. You hash out over dinner. A felony that carries prison time and destroys professional licenses. The kind of crime that follows you the rest of your life. I thought about Preston sitting at my kitchen table 18 months ago asking me to sign the guarantee, his hand on my shoulder. Dad, this is just a formality. I thought about the court docket from 2017, the first business partner he'd restructured out. I thought about Alara mentioning Uncle James and the maps on Preston's office wall. And now this. Someone forging my signature on a legal document to change how my land could be used, filed 2 months before Preston told me I didn't fit the hotel's image. What do we do? I asked. Lorraine pulled out another folder. We document everything. We get the notary records. We build the case. And then you decide whether you want to report this to the authorities or use it as leverage. She paused. But Lawrence, if you don't report it and someone else discovers the forgery later, you could be implicated. This is the kind of thing that needs to be handled carefully. I nodded slowly. How long until you have the notary records? End of the week. I put in a priority request. Then we wait, I said. I left Lorraine's office at 9:30 and drove back to Parsons. Spent the rest of Monday working in my office, organizing documents, making notes in the ledger. Tuesday morning at 10:30, someone knocked on my front door. I looked through the window and saw a black BMW parked in my gravel driveway completely out of place, next to my 2009 F-150. A man stood on my porch wearing a tailored Nashville suit and polished leather shoes. I opened the door. "Mr. Thornton," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Terrence Whitfield Preston's strategic partner at Kestrel Capital. I'd like to explain everything about the resort opportunity." I looked at him for 3 full seconds, studied his face, his expensive suit, his practiced smile. Then I opened the door wider and walked to the kitchen without saying a word. I heard him step inside, heard the door close behind him. I didn't offer him a seat, just walked straight to the kitchen and started brewing a full pot of coffee, letting him stand alone in my living room. I'd learned in freight that the best time to negotiate is when the other driver doesn't know you've already seen the bill, of lading doesn't know you've counted the damaged cargo, doesn't know you hold every receipt that proves exactly who's liable, and Terrence Whitfield had just walked into my house carrying lies I'd already documented. While the coffee brewed, I let him absorb the environment. Simple wooden furniture that Hazel and I had bought in 1985, her wedding photo on the mantel, framed pictures of Bennett Freight's opening day in 1982, me standing next to a single truck, 31 years old, building something from nothing, the manual wall calendar still showing November, the kind you flip by hand instead of checking on your phone. This was the house where I'd raised Preston on a freight driver's income, where Hazel had done the accounting at the kitchen table every Sunday night, where we'd taught our son that you build things slowly, honestly, by doing the work yourself, instead of restructuring other people out of what they'd earned. The coffee finished brewing. I poured 2 mugs and walked back to the living room, set one down in front of Terrence with deliberate precision, the ceramic meeting the wooden table with a soft thud. I sat down in the chair across from him, looked at him, said one word. "Talk?" Terrence pulled a pristine manila folder from his monogrammed leather briefcase, unzipping it with a fluid metallic click that shattered the quiet of my living room. With the practiced, effortless confidence of a high-stakes corporate closer who had finalized hundreds of multi-million-dollar deals, he spread 3 documents across my worn oak coffee table. He smoothed the edges of the paper with the flat of his hand, adjusting them so they faced me precisely, an immaculate presentation designed to overwhelm with professionalism. He started with the first page, which displayed a complex, multi-tiered organizational chart, a sterile labyrinth of geometric boxes and sharp black lines connecting corporate entities I had never heard of in my life. Kestrel Capital Partners sat aggressively at the absolute apex of the hierarchy. Directly beneath it, connected by a thick vertical line, was Lakeview Hospitality Management. From that enclosure, 3 distinct subsidiary LLCs branched outward and downward, like the encroaching roots of an invasive tree, wrapping around assets that used to feel entirely personal. We have intentionally structured this specific acquisition to maximize day-to-day operational efficiency, while fundamentally preserving the property's unique historic character. Terrence said, his manicured index finger tracing the stark lines between the corporate boxes. Kestrel currently owns and operates 17 premier properties across the Southeast boutique, luxury resorts, sprawling conference centers, and experiential hospitality venues. Lakeview fits perfectly, almost seamlessly, into our existing regional portfolio. He spoke with an accelerated, rhythmic pace, his enthusiasm projecting a genuine warmth, like an art appraiser describing a priceless masterpiece, rather than a ruthless corporate lawyer outlining a cold business transaction. He explained with sweeping gestures how they plan to systematically rebrand the entire resort under the sophisticated hospitality management umbrella. He detailed their aggressive strategy to invest heavily in immediate capital improvements, upgrading the outdated HVAC systems, significantly expanding the conference facilities to attract corporate clients, and installing premium guest amenities to justify a massive hike in room rates. I watched his hands move with fluid precision across the crisp white pages, noting how the gold links on his cuffs caught the afternoon light. I listened to his voice rise and fall with perfectly practiced inflections, a cadence tuned over a career of calming nervous sellers. I sat perfectly still, waiting patiently for the exact staggering number I had previously glimpsed in the intercepted email to finally appear in his verbal pitch. The true beauty of this specific corporate structure, Terence continued, his smile widening as he smoothly pulled out the second document from the stack, is that it elegantly allows Preston to retain full day-to-day operational control on the ground, while Kestrel provides the massive capital infrastructure, financial backing, and national brand recognition. He stays on indefinitely as the managing director. We handle the entire back end, the complex accounting, the digital marketing, the overarching corporate strategy. He looked up and smiled warmly at me, his expression radiating the absolute certainty that he was offering a magnificent, life-changing gift to an old man. It is quite frankly the ideal partnership for a legacy property of this incredible caliber. What is the actual valuation? I asked, cutting directly through his narrative. Terence blinked twice, his smooth cadence faltering as he was caught slightly off guard by the blunt, uncompromising directness of my question. He shifted his weight on the sofa, adjusting his tie. Well, the current independent appraisal, which is based strictly on comparable regional properties and highly conservative projected revenue streams, puts Lakeview at... He glanced down at the third document, pretending to verify a number he undoubtedly knew by heart. We are currently working with a $34 million baseline acquisition value. That is a conservative estimate, actually. Once we successfully implement the Phase 2 expansion and fully optimize the digital booking algorithms we are projecting. He kept talking, his mouth moving in an endless stream of corporate jargon, but my brain instantly stopped processing his words. $34 million, spoken completely out loud in the quiet of my home. Not hidden in a cryptic encrypted email file, not buried deep within a mountain of corporate correspondence I had uncovered entirely by accident. Said directly and unapologetically to my face by the very man Preston had personally chosen to structure this entire secret deal. 34 million. Preston had looked me dead in the eye and told me the entire project was worth about $9 million at best. Maybe 10 million if the volatile regional market held perfectly steady. That is exactly what he had whispered when I signed the personal guarantee, when I legally put my name on the commercial lease, when I willingly gave him full legal access to the 40 pristine acres of timberland that Hazel and I had bought together back in 1998. 9 million. And now Terence was sitting comfortably in my living room drinking my coffee, telling me they valued it at 34. I did not interrupt his flow. I did not angrily confront him with the truth. I just sat there in absolute silence, absorbing the devastating confirmation while he continued, describing complex earn-out structures, performance milestones, and intricate revenue-sharing agreements. Outside my window, a heavy city garbage truck reversed loudly down the narrow street, its harsh, rhythmic warning beep cutting sharply through Terence's smooth explanation. I watched a lone sanitation worker heave heavy black bags into the mechanical compactor with a brutal, repetitive efficiency, while inside Terence passionately described how Kestrel Capital planned to preserve the resort's irreplaceable legacy brand. The garbage truck eventually moved on its engine fading. Terence kept talking without missing a beat. He stayed for exactly 45 minutes total. When he finally gathered his documents, slid them back into his briefcase, and stood up to leave, he shook my hand with that exact same practiced, unwavering confidence. I know this is a tremendous amount of information to process, Mr. Thornton. Preston speaks incredibly highly of you, and I want you to know that Kestrel values family legacy just as deeply as we value operational excellence. We are absolutely not here to erase what you built. We are here to help it grow. I nodded slowly. I said nothing. I walked him to the front door and stood on the porch, watching his gleaming black BMW pull smoothly out of my gravel driveway, kicking up dust. The moment his car cleared the gate, I pulled out my phone and called Lorraine. She answered on the very first ring, her voice tight with immediate tension. "Lawrence, when did Preston first meet with the representatives from Kestrel Capital?" I asked. No warm preamble, No explanation for the call. The line went completely quiet for a long moment, the silence stretching between us. Why are you asking me this right now? Because I need to know exactly when this betrayal started, Lorraine. Another pause stretched over the line. Longer, heavier this time. I will have to check the secure records, she said carefully, her professional caution kicking in. Lorraine, I injected every ounce of authority I had left into her name. April, she said quietly, her voice dropping an octave. April 2023. That is when the very first contact occurred, based entirely on the hidden email trail I pulled from the county filings last night. I sat down heavily at my kitchen table, my knees suddenly feeling weak. April 2023. 7 months ago. 2 full months before I had even been told that an outside investor was involved in the expansion. 2 months before Preston had mentioned a single syllable about restructuring equity deals or bringing in outside capital. April. I had been out at the resort working alongside him in April. I had helped Preston resolve a major plumbing issue in one of the luxury guest suites, ruining a pair of boots in the process. I had stood right next to him in the unfinished lobby while he passionately explained his grand vision for the opening night. I had shaken his hand warmly when he thanked me with tears in his eyes for always believing in his dreams. And the entire time he had already been secretly negotiating with Kestrel Capital, already discussing acquisition values, planning earnout structures, and figuring out how to position the deal to cut me out, while asking me for my casual input on which ceramic tiles to use in the bathrooms. Lawrence, are you all right? Lorraine asked, her voice cracking with genuine concern. I looked out my kitchen window at the perimeter fence I had just finished building with my own 2 hands. 48 feet of solid Tennessee pine, standing perfectly straight and level, completed the very same weekend I had decided to stop waiting for answers and start acting. I am fine, I said, my voice completely flat. What did Terrence tell you? He told me the resort is valued at $34 million. Lorraine did not respond immediately, the sheer magnitude of the fraud hanging heavily in the air between us. And Preston told you 9, she said, finally confirming the depth of the lie. Yes. Lawrence, I need you to document absolutely everything Terrence said during that meeting. Write it down right now while it is completely fresh in your mind. Exact numbers, exact phrases, his exact demeanor. If this goes to a court of law, we will need every shred of contemporary evidence. I will, I said, cutting her off gently. But first I need to know what else my son has been hiding from me. I hung up the phone without waiting for a reply and opened my laptop on the wooden table. If Preston had been conducting secret high-level negotiations with corporate investors since April, meeting with them in private, structuring complex deals, planning massive expansions, all while pretending to value my emotional and financial partnership, what else had he done behind my back during those long months? What other legal documents had he forged or filed? What other binding agreements had he signed on my behalf? What other corporate plans had he made on the very land that still bore my family name? With a steady, deliberate hand, I typed Preston's full legal name into the official Tennessee County Property Records database and clicked search. Lorraine slid the Tennessee ABC records across her desk without saying a word. I'd driven to Nashville Wednesday morning after spending Tuesday night searching property records on my laptop. Found nothing new in the county database, just the forged amendment we already knew about. But Lorraine had called at 7 a.m. with a different lead one she wanted to show me in person. Now I sat in her office looking at a document I'd never seen before. Tennessee Alcoholic Beverage Commission. Retail liquor license application for Lakeview Grand Resort. Filed June 2022, approved August 2022, and there under designated responsible party was my name, Lawrence Thornton. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. What does this mean? I asked. Lorraine leaned back in her chair. It means Preston needed someone with clean personal credit and no corporate baggage to be listed as the responsible party for the liquor license. So he used you, without telling me, without telling you. I set the document down on her desk. Explain what designated responsible party means. Under Tennessee law, the designated responsible party is personally liable for any ABC violations at the establishment. If the resort overserves someone who causes an accident, if they sell to minors, if they violate any state liquor regulations, The ABC goes after you, personally, not the business. You can face fines, criminal charges, license suspensions. She pulled out another page, the ABC statute highlighted in yellow. Your name has been on this license since August 2022. 16 months. Every day the resort has been operating, you've been the one legally responsible for every drink they've served. I thought about the grand opening, the champagne toast, the open bar Preston had bragged about in his marketing materials. All of it happening under a license that bore my name, making me personally liable for anything that went wrong. Did Preston forge my signature on this application too? I asked. Lorraine shook her head. No, this one appears to have your actual signature. I compared it to the samples you gave me. It's genuine. I tried to remember signing it. June 2022, 18 months ago. Preston had brought me a stack of documents. One afternoon said they were routine licensing paperwork for the resort. I'd signed them without reading every page because he was my son and I trusted him to tell me what mattered. The same mistake I'd made with the loan guarantee, the same mistake I'd made with the lease, the same mistake I'd been making for 18 months while Preston systematically positioned me to absorb every risk and removed me from every benefit. He's trying to remove your name from every financial benefit, Lorraine said quietly, but he put your name on every legal liability. The loan guarantee, the liquor license, the forged amendment. Everything that could go wrong lands on you. Everything that goes right belongs to him. I thanked Lorraine, drove home, and did not call my son. Thanksgiving arrived the next day. I woke up Thursday morning at 6, the same time I'd woken up every Thanksgiving for 40 years. Made coffee. Stood at the kitchen window watching November fog settle over the 40 acres. Last year, Preston and Simone had come for dinner. We'd sat at this same table, me, Preston, Simone, and Alara. Pleasant conversation about the resort's progress, about Alara's school year, about plans for the holidays. Simone had brought a pie. Preston had helped me carve the turkey. That was last year. This year I cooked for one. Small turkey, mashed potatoes, bread. The same meal Hazel used to make, scaled down to fit one plate instead of 4. I set the table at noon, single place, setting glass of watercloth. Napkin Hazel had embroidered in 1988. Sat down in my usual chair. Looked at the empty seat across from me. That had been Hazel's chair for 34 years. After she died, Preston sometimes sat there when he visited, and before that, when he was growing up, that's where he'd sat for every family dinner from age 5 until he moved out at 22. Now it was just empty. I ate in absolute silence. No television, no radio. Just the sound of my fork against the plate and the wall clock ticking above the sink. When I finished, I cleared the dishes, washed them by hand, dried them, put them away, wiped down the counter, folded the dish towel. Then I walked to my office and opened the ledger. I flipped past 18 months of documentation. Every excluded meeting, every removed email, every unacknowledged contribution, past the strategic checklist I'd written 2 weeks ago, to a fresh page at the back. I wrote the date November 23rd, 2023. The weather cloudy 48 degrees. And then a single phrase decided, Monday. The ledger entry took 6 seconds to write. The decision had taken 6 months. I closed the ledger and sat at my desk for a while looking at the wall calendar. Thursday the 23rd, Friday the 24th, Saturday, Sunday, then Monday, November 27th. 4 days. I'd spent 10 days discovering what Preston had hidden. I'd documented 18 months of systematic exclusion. I'd confirmed the $34 million lie. I'd found the forged amendment. I'd learned about the liquor license that put my name on criminal liability, while Preston claimed all the profits. And I'd decided. I picked up my phone at 9:47 that night and called Lorraine. She answered on the second ring. Lawrence, is everything all right? I looked out my office window at the fence I'd finished 2 weeks ago, standing straight and solid in the dark. Monday, I said. We send everything. Lorraine's email arrived at 6:32 Friday morning with the subject line FW Confidential. R.E. Thornton background verification. I was drinking coffee at my kitchen table when my phone buzzed. Opened the email, read the first line. Lawrence Terrence Whitfield made a mistake this morning. You need to see this immediately. Attached was a forwarded email chain. I clicked on the attachment and started reading. From Terrence Whitfield. To Jennifer Strauss, Kestrel Capital Legal Counsel, C.C. Lorraine Hewitt. Sent at 9:17 a.m. the previous day, Thursday Thanksgiving, while I'd been sitting alone at my kitchen table deciding to take action. The email was brief. Jennifer attaching background verification docs on L. Thornton, per your request. Financial profile confirms manageable risk level for Phase 2 structuring. Family records provided by P. Thornton show clean credit, stable asset base, no litigation history. Recommend proceeding as discussed. And beneath that, a PDF attachment. I downloaded it, opened it, stared at my own financial statement, the one I had submitted confidentially to the bank 18 months ago when I signed the loan guarantee. Every detail, every account, assets, debts, credit history. The savings accounts Hazel had left behind when she died. The Bennett freight sale proceeds. The value of my house. The 40 acres. All of it compiled in a neat 7-page document that Preston had pulled from family records and handed to Terrence Whitfield, like a dossier on a business opponent instead of a report on his father. I drove to Nashville. Lorraine was waiting when I walked into her office at 8:30. Terrence sent this to me by mistake, she said without preamble. He meant to send it only to Kestrel's legal team, accidentally CC'd me instead. She slid a printed copy across her desk. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. Saw Hazel's account numbers, the ones she'd set up in 1995, the ones that still bore her name 7 years after her death. Saw the loan guarantee I'd signed in April 2022, thinking I was helping my son get started. Preston gave your dead wife's financial records to an investor, Lorraine said quietly, to prove you weren't a litigation risk. I set the printout down. He needed to show Kestrel Capital that I wouldn't fight back, I said, that I was manageable. Yes. I folded the printout and set it on Lorraine's desk without saying anything for a long time. Hazel had spent 30 years protecting our financial privacy. She'd taught me never to share account information unnecessarily, never to give anyone access to records they didn't absolutely need to see. She'd kept meticulous files, organized everything in color-coded folders, locked it all in the safe I still kept in my office. And Preston had taken those records, pulled them from family files, scanned them, handed them to an investor without asking permission, without telling me, using my dead wife's financial history as evidence that I could be safely excluded from decisions about a business I'd made legally possible. Lorraine pulled another document from her folder. There's something else, she said. I got the notary certification records back from the county. She placed it in front of me. The notary who authorized your signature on the forged amendment is named Rebecca Caldwell. I ran her name through the corporate filing database. She pulled out 3 more documents. She's notarized 3 other corporate filings for Preston's LLC since 2021. Business formation documents, operating agreement amendments, contract certifications. I looked at the dates. June 2021, March 2022, August 2022. This isn't Simone acting alone, Lorraine said. The notary connection goes straight to Preston's office. Rebecca Caldwell is someone he's used repeatedly for corporate filings, and she's the same person who notarized a signature that isn't yours on a document that changed your land use rights without your consent. She leaned forward. Lawrence, if this goes to the DA, your son is looking at a felony charge. Document forgery. Notary fraud. These aren't civil matters. These are criminal acts. I sat back in the chair and looked at the documents spread across Lorraine's desk. The misdirected email showing Preston had shared my private financial records. The notary certification connecting the forged amendment directly to Preston's corporate attorney. The liquor license putting my name on criminal liability. The change of control clause that would destroy me the moment Preston signed his equity deal. The 18 months of documented exclusion in my ledger. The $34 million valuation he'd hidden while telling me the project was worth $9 million. This isn't about money anymore, I said quietly. Lorraine nodded. How do you tell the police your son committed a crime when you still remember teaching him to write his name? When you remember sitting at the kitchen table, helping him with homework, showing him how to sign his first checking account signature card, watching him graduate college? How do you turn over evidence that could send him to prison when you're the one who raised him, who taught him right from wrong, who believed he understood the difference? Lorraine leaned back in her chair and asked the question we had both been avoiding. If we don't call the police, what can we do? I looked at the email printout, the notary records, the liquor license with my name on it, all the evidence of systematic deception and criminal exposure Preston had created, while I trusted him. "We can use it," I said. "Right time, right way." Alara ran across my backyard on Saturday morning, holding a crayon drawing above her head like a flag. "Grandpa, look what I made. I was cleaning the fish pond filter, a task I'd done every November for 25 years. When she appeared around the oak tree, her jacket unzipped despite the cold. Preston and Celeste must have brought her over early. "What have you got there, sweetheart?" She thrust the paper at me, breathless. The drawing showed a blocky brown building with blue windows. Stick figures stood in front. Behind the building she'd drawn a wobbly oval filled with green scribbles. "It's Daddy's hotel," she pointed to the oval. "And that's the fish pond like yours. Daddy says they're gonna dig it real big." My hands went still on the filter housing. "What fish pond, honey?" "The one behind his hotel. He has a map in his office with all the lines." I traced some with my finger. She made a sweeping gesture. "The lines go way past the lake." I stared at the green oval on her drawing. The placement was exact directly behind the resort's main building, right where my 40 acres sat. "Did you see this map recently?" "Yesterday. Mommy was mad 'cause Daddy had to work late again, so I went to his office, and he let me color while he talked on the phone." She leaned closer, conspiratorial. "He said Phase 2 a bunch of times. Phase 2. Alara chattered on about her drawing, but I'd stopped listening. I was seeing Preston's office, as she must have seen it. The architect's map on his wall survey lines extending across property he didn't own plans. Already drawn for land he expected to acquire. Land he'd tried to acquire through fraud. The fish pond I'd dug with Hazel in 1998. The clearing where we'd scattered her ashes. The oak grove where Ilara herself played when they visited. All of it already incorporated into his expansion map, as if my signature on that forged amendment had been a foregone conclusion. "Grandpa, you okay?" I realized I'd been gripping the pond filter hard enough to hurt. I set it down carefully. "I'm fine, sweetheart. That's a beautiful drawing. Why don't you take it inside and show Grandma's picture on the mantel? I bet she'd love to see it." Sometimes silence screams louder than accusations. After Alara skipped toward the house, I stood in my backyard, looking at the land Hazel and I had built our life on. The fish pond caught the morning light surface rippling in the breeze. From here I could see the resort's roof, line a quarter-mile away, that monument to Preston's ambition rising above the tree line. He'd already planned for this land, probably months ago, maybe longer. The forged amendment wasn't desperation, it was implementation. Someone had drawn those survey lines knowing exactly where they'd extend, had calculated the square footage, had projected the revenue from a Phase 2 that treated my refusal as a temporary obstacle. I pulled out my phone and typed a message to Preston. "Need to talk. Diner on Oak Street tomorrow, 9 a.m. Just us." His reply came 40 seconds later. "Okay, not. What's this about? Not. Is everything all right?" Just acknowledgement, as if he'd been expecting this. I spent the rest of Saturday deciding what to say, then realized Sunday morning that words weren't the point. The diner was nearly empty when I arrived at 8:50. I took the corner booth, the same one where I'd told Hazel I wanted to buy the 40 acres back in 1987, where she'd smiled and said, "Then let's build something that lasts." Preston walked in at 9, exactly scanning the room before he saw me. He moved with the careful neutrality of a man approaching a negotiation, his expression pleasant and unreadable. "Morning, Dad." He slid into the opposite seat. "What's going on?" I didn't answer. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the photocopy Lorraine had obtained from the county recorder's office, and slid it across the table. Preston looked down. This was the moment I'd been watching for. If he'd been innocent, if Gerald Howell had acted alone, if Preston knew nothing about the forged signature, he would have asked what he was looking at. His eyes would have scanned the document with genuine confusion before finding the signature line, before noticing his own name typed beneath my forged handwriting. He didn't ask. His gaze went directly to the signature, focused there for exactly 2 seconds, then lifted to meet mine. No confusion, no question. Just the flat, measured stare of a man who recognized what he was seeing and knew precisely what it meant. The waitress appeared with coffee. "You fellas ready to order?" "Not yet." I said, not looking away from my son. She retreated. The coffee sat untouched between us. Preston's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He didn't reach for the document, didn't pick it up to examine it closer, didn't turn it over to check for additional pages. His hands stayed flat on the table, and in that stillness I saw everything I'd been trying not to see for 3 weeks. He'd known about the amendment, maybe not every detail of Howell's execution, maybe not the exact timing, but he'd known. The recognition in his eyes wasn't surprise at discovering fraud. It was calculation about what my possession of this document meant. "Tell me," I said. The words came out quieter than I'd intended, but they landed heavy in the space between us. Outside, a truck rumbled past. Someone laughed at the counter. The whole ordinary world kept turning while I sat across from my son, waiting for him to explain how we'd arrived here. Preston stared at the forged signature bearing my name. The name he shared, the legacy I'd tried to build for him, and for the first time since he'd sat down, something cracked in his careful composure. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Tell me," I repeated. Preston set the document down and spoke without looking up. "You were never going to let go, Dad." I stayed quiet. The forged amendment sat between us on the table, my fake signature visible from where I sat. "I needed that land," he continued, "for Phase 2. For the resort to work long term. You knew that. Everyone knew that. But you wouldn't even discuss it." His voice stayed level, reasonable, like he was explaining a business decision to a board. "You would have held on to those documents forever. I just moved things along. Moved things along, as if forging my signature was the same as expediting a permit application. Gerald said it would be clean," Preston said. "Get the amendment filed, start the development, and by the time you noticed, if you even noticed, the land would already be generating revenue. You'd see the numbers and realize it made sense. I watched my son justify fraud with projected earnings. The waitress refilled coffee cups 2 booths away. A truck pulled into the parking lot outside. The ordinary world kept running while Preston explained how he'd planned to steal 40 acres from his own father. "You built something great with Bennett Freight," he said, finally looking up. "But that was yours. This is mine. The resort, the expansion, the whole vision, that's what I'm building, and I needed room to build it." The entry twist landed like a blade between my ribs. He wasn't apologizing. He was blaming me. In Preston's framework, my refusal to surrender land I'd owned for 36 years had forced him to commit fraud. I'd made him do it by being unwilling to let go. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Preston shifted in his seat. His coffee sat untouched, going cold. Finally, I leaned forward. "Did your mother teach you that, or did you figure it out on your own?" Preston's face went white. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The question had found its mark, because we both knew the answer. Hazel would have been horrified. She'd taught him about building things that lasted, about doing right by people, about earning what you claimed. Everything Preston had just said would have broken her heart. He looked away. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I stood, pulled 2 10s from my wallet, and set them on the table next to the cold coffee. "When you figure out what you actually want to say to me," I told him, "you know where I live." I walked out without waiting for a response. Some confessions don't ask for forgiveness, they demand you share the blame. I spent Monday working in the yard replacing fence posts that didn't need replacing, cleaning gutters that were already clean. Physical work to keep my hands busy, while my mind circled the same question, what now? The forged amendment was a crime. James Aldrich had confirmed that. I could turn it over to law enforcement, I could file a civil suit, I could call the State Real Estate Commission and have Gerald Howell's license pulled. Or I could do nothing and watch my son build his empire on fraud. I was splitting firewood when my phone rang just after 7. Preston's name on the screen. I set down the axe and answered. "Dad?" His voice sounded strange, flat, distant, like he was calling from very far away instead of 3 miles up the road. "I need to tell you something." I waited. "I went home yesterday after the diner, confronted Simone about the amendment, about Gerald, about all of it." He paused. I could hear him breathing. "She didn't deny it, didn't apologize, just looked at me and said, 'You built this, Preston. I just helped you not get your hands dirty.'" I walked to the porch and sat on the steps, phone pressed to my ear. "Then she grabbed her purse and walked out." Preston continued. "Didn't pack a bag, didn't say where she was going, just left. I thought maybe she'd come back, cool off, we'd talk it through. Another pause. Longer this time. But this morning I went into her home office to find her contact list, people I should call. And there was a suitcase behind her desk, already packed. Clothes, toiletries, cash, everything. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. She had a bag packed, Dad. Already packed. Before I ever said a word to her about the amendment, she was ready to disappear the moment this fell apart. The exit twist hit. With cold precision, Simone hadn't fled in panic. She'd maintained an exit strategy all along, a pre-planned escape route for when her role in the forgery was exposed. The packed bag meant she'd always known this day might come, and had prepared for it with the same calculated efficiency she'd brought to the fraud itself. "How long has it been there?" I asked. "I don't know. Could be weeks, could be months. The clothes inside are summer weight. She must have packed it back in August, September." He let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "All this time, I thought we were building something together. The resort, the expansion, the whole future. And she had a bag packed in case she needed to run. I listened to my son breathe on the other end of the line. 41 years old, successful by every conventional measure, and suddenly discovering that the person closest to him had been planning her exit since summer. "Have you talked to Elara?" I asked. "She's at Celeste's parents' for the week. Thank God. I don't know what I'd tell her." "You tell her the truth," I said. "That sometimes people make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes have consequences." "Is that what you're telling me?" "I'm telling you what I would have told you 20 years ago if you'd asked." Another long silence. "Are you okay?" I asked finally. The question hung in the air between us. Outside, the November wind rattled the oak branches. Inside my chest, something twisted anger and grief, and a terrible understanding that my son had built his success on sand, and was only now feeling it shift beneath him. "I don't know, Dad," Preston said quietly. "I don't know." It was the first time in 2 years he'd admitted not knowing anything. We stayed on the line a few seconds longer, neither of us speaking, then he hung up without saying goodbye. I sat on my porch steps holding the phone long after the call ended, listening to the dial tone turn to silence. My son had justified betraying me by blaming me for building something worth taking, and his wife had walked out with a bag she'd packed before he ever confronted her. Lorraine spread 2 stacks of documents across her desk, Tuesday morning, and said, "Pick one." I'd driven to her office at 8:30 without calling ahead. She'd taken one look at my face and cleared her schedule. She tapped the left stack. "This triggers loan acceleration. The forgery constitutes fraud. The confidentiality breach violates the NDA. Preston's involvement creates a change of control issue. The bank demands $8 million immediately. The resort can't pay. Total bankruptcy." Her finger moved to the right stack. "This is controlled reset. Complete rewrite of all agreements with absolute transparency. You retain total control of your land. Preston operates the resort under strictly defined terms. The bank restructures with new covenants. Gerald Howell loses his license and faces criminal charges, but Preston gets a chance to rebuild legitimately." She sat back and waited. I looked at both stacks. The left one was thicker motions, complaints, acceleration notices, the language of destruction. The right stack was thinner but denser. New operating agreements, revised loan documents, transparency protocols. "What would you do?" I asked. "I'm your attorney, not your conscience," Lorraine said. "But I've watched clients choose revenge over resolution for 30 years. The ones who burn everything down think they'll feel better after. They never do." I thought about Bennett Freight. 35 years building a company on handshake deals and clean ledgers. 3 other freight companies in the region had gone under while I was running it, 2 from internal theft and 1 from a lawsuit that bankrupted everyone involved. I'd attended all 3 funerals, sat in the back, watched good people destroyed by fights nobody won. "How much damage does it take to prove a point, Lorraine?" I said. "I didn't build Bennett Freight by burning things down." She nodded. "Then you want the right stack." "I want my son to have a chance to do better," I said. "But I want it crystal clear he's operating a business on my land, under my terms. No forgery, no fraud, no hidden deals. Absolute transparency, or I pull it down myself." Lorraine made a note. "That's the controlled reset. I'll need a week to finalize everything. We'll need to coordinate timing." "Timing?" You don't just file these documents, she said. You deploy them strategically. She pulled up a calendar on her computer and turned the screen toward me. Simone scheduled a VIP investor opening for Monday, December 4th. Secondary press, potential expansion partners, the whole show. She set it up weeks ago before any of this surfaced. I saw where she was going. You want to file the morning of the event. 6 a.m., Lorraine said. 4 actions simultaneously. Formal notice to the bank triggering change of control review. Freeze request to the county recorder regarding the fraudulent amendment. Withdrawal of your cooperation letter to Terrence Whitfield. Formal letter to the Tennessee ABC requesting immediate review of the designated responsible party on the liquor license. She leaned forward. Preston receives everything before the event starts. He'll have to decide in real time whether to cancel, postpone, or explain to investors why his attorney just received 4 legal notices. It's not vindictive, it's strategic. We're forcing total transparency at the moment when hiding anything would be fatal. I thought about the day I'd walked away from Bennett Freight with a handshake and a clean ledger, nothing burning behind me. The buyer had been nervous about the transition. I'd spent 2 weeks introducing him personally to every major account, vouching for him, making sure the handoff was clean. That company was still running, still profitable, still treating people right. Some fights you win by refusing to destroy what you're fighting for. Do it, I said. Lorraine pulled the right stack toward her and began organizing the documents into execution order. I watched her work, precise, methodical, building the framework that would protect my land while giving Preston a chance to earn back what he'd tried to take. One more thing, I said. When this is over, I want a meeting. Me, Preston, you, and whoever represents him, face to face. We set the terms clearly. Agreed, Lorraine said. After the December 4th filings, we'll schedule it. Give Preston a week to process, then we rebuild the structure properly. I left her office at 10:30 and drove home. The next 6 days moved slowly. I worked on the property fix things that needed fixing and waited. Monday morning, December 4th, I woke at 5:30, made coffee, sat on my porch and watched the sky lighten over the 40 acres Hazel and I had bought in 1987. The December fog was thick enough that I couldn't see the fish pond, but I knew exactly where it was 200 yards southeast, surrounded by oak trees we'd planted the year we dug it. My phone buzzed at 6:03. One word sent. Timing isn't cruelty when the truth was always going to hurt. I sat there with my coffee, imagining the cascade Lorraine had just triggered. The bank's compliance officer opening an urgent email. The county recorder receiving a freeze request. Terrence Whitfield's assistant forwarding a withdrawal of cooperation. The Tennessee ABC routing a formal review request. 4 arrows launched at once. No warning, no negotiation, just the systematic application of consequences that Preston had set in motion the moment he'd approved that forged signature. Simone had scheduled the VIP investor event for 10 a.m. Preston would have 3 hours and 57 minutes to decide what to tell them. I wasn't destroying his resort. I was forcing him to run it honestly or not at all. The fog began lifting around 6:30, revealing the oak grove and the pond and the clearing where we'd scattered Hazel's ashes. The land looked the same as yesterday, but everything had changed. The forged amendment would be frozen at the county recorder. The bank would begin reviewing whether Preston's involvement constituted a material change requiring loan restructuring. The liquor license would face scrutiny, and Preston would have to explain it all to investors who'd driven from Nashville and Memphis expecting champagne and expansion plans. Lorraine's text still glowed on my screen. One word that meant 4 legal actions deployed with surgical precision. I finished my coffee and went inside to wait for whatever came next. Preston's phone buzzed at 9:47 Monday morning, while he stood in the resort lobby shaking hands with VIP investors. I wasn't there, but Celeste Sinclair was. She told me about it the next day, every detail sharp in her memory, like she'd been waiting to tell someone who'd actually understand. Preston had been mid-sentence with a potential expansion partner from Memphis when his phone lit up. He'd glanced down, excused himself, and stepped into the hallway. Through the glass doors, Celeste watched his posture change, shoulders tightening, hand going to his forehead. The call lasted 90 seconds. When he came back inside, his face had gone pale. "Everything all right?" the Memphis investor asked. Preston managed a smile. "Fine. Excuse me one moment." He rejoined the group, shook more hands, made small talk about the resort's amenities. At 10:03 the phone buzzed again. This time Preston didn't even try to hide his reaction. He looked at the screen and his jaw tightened visibly. Another exit to the hallway. Another 90-second call. When he returned, the smile was gone. Celeste had positioned herself near the refreshment table, with a clear sight line to the entrance. She'd been hired by Simone back in October to write a feature on the resort for a regional lifestyle magazine, the kind of soft focus piece that made boutique hotels look like destinations instead of businesses. She'd attended the November 11th opening and filed a preliminary draft. This December 4th event was supposed to give her material for the expansion angle. Instead, she was watching Preston Thornton come apart in real time. The third call came at 10:21. Preston was standing in the center of the lobby when his phone rang. He answered without stepping away this time, maybe because he'd already lost track of maintaining appearances. Celeste couldn't hear the caller, but she heard Preston's half of the conversation. Terence, a pause. "No, wait, just let me—" Another pause longer. Then Preston's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Don't do this." Whatever Terence said next made Preston close his eyes. The call ended. Preston stood frozen in the middle of his own lobby phone, still against his ear, even though the line had gone dead, while 20 VIP guests pretended not to notice. One of them noticed, though. Celeste Sinclair watched all three exits. She wrote down the exact times in her notebook. "She called me Tuesday afternoon at 2. I was splitting firewood when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Mr. Thornton. This is Celeste Sinclair. I'm a journalist. I got your number from the county recorder's office. It's on the public filing for your property easement." I set down the axe and wiped my hands on my jeans. "What can I do for you, Miss Sinclair? I was at the Lakeview Grand Resort yesterday for their VIP investor event. Your son told me back in November that you were getting older and preferred to stay home. But I watched him take 3 phone calls yesterday that looked like his world was ending." I walked to the porch and sat on the steps. "I see. The first one came at 9:47 a.m., she continued. "Based on his reaction and the timing, I'd guess it was his bank. The second was 10:03. He looked angry more than scared that time. The third was 10:21. Someone named Terence. Preston asked him not to do something, then just stood there after the call ended." She paused, and I heard papers rustling on her end. "I did some research this afternoon," Celeste said. "Found a filing at the county recorder dated December 4th regarding an amendment to your property easement. Found a notice to the Tennessee Alcoholic Beverage Commission requesting review of the resort's designated responsible party. Found a withdrawal of cooperation letter sent to Terence Whitfield, the resort's general manager." I stayed quiet, let her talk. "Simone hired me in October to write a feature piece about the resort," she said. "The kind of story that makes a place look successful and inevitable. She gave me the whole narrative. Local entrepreneur, builds dream resort, honors. His father's legacy creates jobs, brings economic development to the region. She let that sit between us for a moment. But your name isn't anywhere in the resort's promotional materials, Mr. Thornton. Not in the lobby. Not in the press releases. Not in the mission statement. The only place I found you was in the county. Records 40 acres of prime lakefront property, with an easement agreement that looks like it was written by someone trying very hard to make something complicated look simple." I thought about Preston standing in that lobby taking those 3 calls. His carefully constructed collapsing in front of the very people he'd been trying to impress. I thought about Simone scheduling that event weeks in advance before she knew her exit strategy would be needed. I thought about Lorraine timing everything to land at exactly 6 a.m., giving Preston 3 hours and 47 minutes to decide between honesty and pretense. He'd chosen pretense. Of course he had. "Mr. Thornton," Celeste said quietly, "I don't think I want to write the story Simone asked me to write. There's a different story here. How do you tell a stranger the truth about your son when he spent 6 months lying about you?" "What kind of story?" I asked. "The kind about who actually built this place," she said. "Not the resort, I think I understand who built that. but the foundation it sits on, the land, the capital, the reputation that made the bank say yes in the first place. I looked out at the 40 acres Hazel and I had bought in 1987, the oak grove where we'd scattered her ashes, the fish pond we'd dug together in 1998, the clearing where Alara played when she visited, all of it still mine, protected now by Lorraine's surgical precision and Preston's inability to destroy what he couldn't steal. If I tell you I said, it goes in print exactly as I say it. No softening, no both sides framing. The truth. That's what I'm asking for, Celeste said. I sat on my front porch steps with the phone against my ear, watching December sunlight filter through the oak branches. Celeste was quiet on the other end, waiting. All right, I said, I'll tell you. Preston's voice on Wednesday night sounded like someone I hadn't heard in years. Hollow, stripped of the confidence that used to fill every sentence. Dad, I need to come see you. Not a statement. A request? I looked out my kitchen window at the dark backyard where the fence stood, finished in the December cold. When I asked, Saturday, if that's okay. He paused. Is it okay? I thought about the fence posts I'd set on November 10th, while he was cutting ribbons at the resort. I thought about 18 months of excluded meetings. I thought about Hazel, who would have said that asking is always better than assuming. Saturday is fine, I said. He arrived at 9 in the morning, wearing jeans and a casual jacket instead of a suit. We sat at the kitchen table in silence for a long moment. I don't know where to start, he said. Start with the April meeting? So he did. He told me everything when the equity deal started, when he let Simone take over the paperwork, when he first saw the forged amendment, but chose silence because confronting it would mean admitting he'd lost control. He didn't make excuses, didn't blame anyone else, just laid out the timeline like a manifest of cargo gone wrong. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet, except for the old clock ticking. I need you to re-sign everything, I said. Transparently, legally correct numbers. Preston nodded. I know. I brewed tea after he left and sat at the table where Hazel used to grade papers. By lamplight, her red pen moving across essays while I worked on Bennett Freight invoices. She'd always said the hardest part of teaching wasn't correcting mistakes. It was watching students make them when you'd already shown them the right way. The formal re-signing happened Friday, December 15th at Lorraine's office. Preston signed every page while she explained what each one meant. Loan guarantee restructured, with a clear 5-year exit clause. For me, liquor license updated with accurate ownership, disclosure fraudulent. Amendment officially nullified by the county recorder. Ernest Dawson attended as independent witness, a strict condition I'd set based on Hazel's original trust protocols. When the last signature was done, Ernest placed a firm hand on Preston's shoulder. Son, he said quietly, this is the start, not the end. Preston looked at him and nodded without speaking. Then Preston noticed the ledger sitting on Lorraine's side table. Is that what I think it is? He asked. I nodded. Can I read it? I slid it across the table. He opened it slowly, turned the pages with careful attention. 18 months of documentation, excluded meetings, removed CC lines, unacknowledged checks, the neat, steady handwriting of a man who'd managed freight manifests for 35 years. He reached the final page. November 10th, 2023. 4 words, he used to help. Preston stared at that entry for a very long time. Then he closed the ledger, set it down, and couldn't find any words to say. Some things you document not to punish, but to remember what was real. Monday morning, Celeste's feature dropped in a Tennessee business journal and spread across the hospitality sector. The headline read, The Man Behind the Resort, Lawrence Thornton Built More Than a Hotel. The article profiled a 69-year-old father, former freight fleet owner, who still wore flannel and drove a 2009 F-150. The man whose name appeared on every foundational document, despite his absence from the November opening. She'd skipped the scandal, entirely focusing purely on who I was and what I'd built before the resort existed. From that day forward, the Lakeview Grand Resort would be permanently tied to the image of the father Preston had dismissed. Preston called that afternoon. Have you seen the article? He asked. Yes. A pause. How do you feel? I looked out at my backyard at the fence standing straight in the winter light. I think your mother would have liked it, I said. Saturday morning, December 23rd. I walked into my backyard at 7 a.m. and looked at the completely finished fence. I ran my palm along the smooth pine level, solid built, right. Every post plumb, every board fitted tight. I thought about 38 years as a father, about Hazel who'd taught high school English for 29 years and never gave a grade. A student didn't earn. About building Bennett Freight from a single truck to an 80-vehicle fleet before selling it with a handshake and a clean ledger. I thought about these 40 acres, the fish pond Hazel and I dug in 1998, the oak tree she planted in 2001, the old fence Preston and I had built together when he was 14. What was lost? What remained? A fence is just wood and nails until you need it to mark what's yours. Building something right means you can walk away from it without wondering if it will hold. The hammer sat on the porch steps where I'd left it on November 10th, 43 days ago. I picked it up, felt its familiar weight, looked at the finished fence one more time. Then I set the hammer back down. The fence was finished. The work was done. I walked inside and started the coffee maker. The machine hissed and gurgled, filling the kitchen with the smell of morning routine. Outside the window, the 40 acres stretched into December fog. The fish pond was invisible in the mist, but I knew exactly where it was. The oak tree Hazel had planted stood quiet and solid. The fence marked the property line with clean, straight boards. The coffee finished brewing. I poured a cup and stood at the window watching the fog begin to lift. December the 23rd, 2023, 7:15 in the morning. Somewhere 3 miles up the road, Preston would be managing the business on land he now operated under transparently restructured terms. Ilara would visit on Christmas. The bank would process payments according to the new schedule. The county recorder held properly executed documents. Everything legal, everything documented, everything honest. I sipped my coffee and watched the morning light filter through the oak branches. The fence stood straight. The land was still mine. Before January arrived, the work I'd started on November 10th was complete. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and set it in the dish rack to dry. And to you listening to my story, remember this family betrayal. Cuts deeper than any stranger's wrong ever could. Looking back now, I made mistakes too. I spent 18 months documenting every exclusion instead of confronting my son directly. I let anger simmer when I should have demanded answers sooner. Don't make my mistake when someone you love starts erasing you. Speak up before the silence becomes permanent. The ledger I kept wasn't revenge. It was proof that what I remembered was real. Here's what I learned. Revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes the strongest thing a dad can do is refuse to burn down what his family built, even when they've burned the trust. I could have triggered that loan acceleration and bankrupted everything Preston worked for. Instead, I chose restraint, restructured agreements, protected my land, told the truth publicly, and set my tools down when the work was finished. That's the kind of revenge that lets you sleep at night, the kind that doesn't make you into the person who hurt you. I believe God put me through this to teach me that building something right means you can walk away from it without wondering if it will hold. Some battles a father wins by refusing to become what he's fighting against. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my position, total revenge or controlled reset? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories about family betrayal and the choices we make, subscribe to Dad's Sweet Revenge. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time matters to me. Final reminder, some details in this story have been adjusted for storytelling, but the lesson about choosing how we respond to family betrayal, that's what I hope you carry forward. God bless you.